Joining me now is author, academic, and international security expert, Dr. Max Abrahms. Max, your field of expertise includes terrorism, foreign policy, and in particular the Middle East. Right now, what do you see as the biggest threat to the West, and are we in a uniquely vulnerable period?
This is a very interesting and dangerous time. We're basically waiting for Israel to carry out its absolutely necessary attack against Iran. Iran, very recently, just a week or two ago, carried out the largest ballistic missile attack ever. And so, of course, Israel is going to respond. Personally, I would like to see Israel try to take out or at least substantially degrade the Iranian nuclear facilities. My understanding, based on public reports, is that that's not going to happen, that the Biden White House is trying to rein Israel in order to limit its attack. But consider the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon. And Iran is basically on the
Mm.
threshold of that happening. It is often said, but it is absolutely true, that Iran is the number one state sponsor in the world. Iran sponsors the Houthis, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Iranian militia, or
Yeah.
militia based in Iraq. And Iran has terrorist operatives all over the world, in North America, in South America, in Europe. So I see that as a very dangerous situation. I think that a stronger response against Iran would make the world safer. But what's going to happen is that the Israeli response is going to be somewhat reined in because of pressure from the Biden White House. Then Iran is going to respond. And depending on that, the size of that response, that will dictate what Israel does next. If the Iranian response is very large, if it's mass casualty attacks against Israeli civilians, then it's possible the
Mm.
Israelis would ignore the Biden White House and go for the nuclear facility. So this is a multiple iteration game. And it's going to play out over the next few weeks, but we're at a very critical time period right now with respect to whether the world is going to contain this Iranian threat.
Now, we've also had revelations from US intelligence officials of a suspected Iranian plot to kill Donald Trump. Joe Biden has responded to this. He's told the Iranian regime that an assassination attempt against Donald Trump would be seen as an act of war. How seriously do you think the Iranian regime takes Joe Biden's words? And why is Iran so hell bent on preventing a second Trump term?
There's a very clear difference moving forward in terms of US policy toward Iran. Kamala Harris is basically seen as an appeaser. She's much more pro Iran. And so it's not that surprising, really, that Iran would take out Donald Trump. Trump was very hardline against Iran last time he was president. He
Mm.
slapped on those maximum pressure economic sanctions against Iran. Towards the end of his administration, towards the end of his term, he authorized taking out the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Soleimani. And so, ever since then, Iran has been a legitimate threat of targeting not just Trump, but also his administration. And so I think that this is a very interesting development, that it's publicly disclosed that Iran, is eyeing the possibility, or at least wants to take out Donald Trump. But I also want American citizens to ask themselves the question, why is it that Iran so much
Mm.
favors Kamala Harris? And I don't think that when you ask that question, it's indicative of a solid foreign policy, because Iran, of course, is a US adversary. It's not just a US adversary, but it's an adversary throughout the region. And I think that if Trump were to win the presidency, he would push the Abraham Accords, which are essentially a means of containing Iran. And I think that Trump would have more success in that than he's often given credit for. I would like to see Saudi Arabia join that
Mm.
coalition in order to contain the Iranian threat. By contrast, I do not see Kamala Harris as pushing the Abraham Accords at all. And I see kind of a similar policy as we saw under the Obama administration, which was a failure.
Well, that was my next question. You mentioned Kamala Harris as an appeaser. What would US foreign policy look like under a Harris-Walz administration, not just in the Middle East, but in terms of China and other threats to the West?
Or the Trump administration is much about the rise of China. Kamala Harris was very recently asked about the main US adversaries around the world, and she didn't even mention China. Um, there's a Elbridge Colby is widely believed to be potentially a defense secretary choice of Trump. And if you listen to him, he is very much focused on the rise of China, defending Taiwan, making sure that China doesn't aggrandize throughout the Pacific, as well as strengthening India in order to act as a hedge against Chinese expansion in the Indo-Pacific. So that's another area where I think that Trump is stronger than Kamala Harris. I think that Kamala, because of the demographics and her constituency at home, would invest a lot of energy in trying to work with Hamas and trying to rekindle a peace process that isn't going to work there. So Americans do have a real foreign policy choice. I think that there would also be differences with respect to the war in Ukraine. I think that the Biden
Mm.
administration and Kamala Harris want to continue to perpetuate that war, whereas I think that Donald Trump is much more interested in ending it, even if it requires Ukraine making some concessions to Russia. So there are a lot of different, balls in the air and some very clear differences between the two main candidates.